She was 21 years old and already in exile. Somewhere east of Alexandria, probably near the Syrian border, she was camped with a mercenary force she had assembled herself, watching a kingdom she had inherited by right get administered by men who had decided she was inconvenient. Inside the palace, her younger brother sat on a throne he was 10 years too young to understand, and the three men who controlled him were not politicians. They were survivors, and they had survived this long by removing obstacles early. Cleopatra knew what she was to them, not a rival to be negotiated with, an obstacle to be solved. The question she was working through, somewhere in that eastern desert, was not whether she could take the throne back. It was whether anyone would still be alive to hold it for her if she waited too long. The Ptolemaic dynasty had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries by the time Cleopatra XII was born, in 69 BC, and in that time it had achieved something almost paradoxical. It had lasted long enough to become structurally dependent on the very empire it had spent generations trying to stay independent from. Rome was everywhere in Ptolemaic politics by the 1st century BC, not as an occupying force, not yet, but as a gravitational presence that bent every decision toward it. Treaties required Roman approval. Loans came from Roman creditors. The legitimacy of a Ptolemaic king sitting on the Egyptian throne was increasingly a matter Rome could ratify, delay, or withhold, depending on what it needed from Alexandria that season. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, had made this dependency visible in the worst possible way. When Cyprus was annexed by Rome in 58 BC and his own brother was stripped of the island and driven to suicide, Ptolemy XII did not resist. He could not. His throne existed because Rome had not yet decided to take it, and any military posture would have accelerated exactly the outcome he was trying to avoid. He sailed to Rome and spent years lobbying senators with money Egypt did not have, borrowing from bankers at ruinous rates to fund his own political survival. Alexandria knew. His court knew. And when he returned to Egypt in 55 BC with Roman soldiers escorting him back to his own palace, the humiliation was architectural. It was built into the structure of his reign in a way that nothing could repair. He was mocked openly. The Alexandrians called him Auletes, the flute player, a name that functioned less as an insult than as a verdict. That his daughter watched this, absorbed it, and drew different conclusions from it than most observers would suggest something about the particular quality of her intelligence. She did not see her father's reign as evidence that accommodation with Rome was shameful. She saw it as evidence that accommodation managed badly was fatal, and that the difference between surviving Rome and being absorbed by it was a matter of timing, positioning, and knowing exactly what Rome needed from you at any given moment. She was the first ruler in her dynasty's history to learn the Egyptian language. The Ptolemies had governed Egypt for 275 years without it, conducting their court in Greek, and treating the country's majority population as a resource rather than a constituency. Cleopatra learned Egyptian. She learned Aramaic, Ethiopian, Hebrew, and several others. Ancient sources credit her with 9 languages total. This was not incidental scholarship. It was political infrastructure. A queen who could address priests in their own language, who could negotiate with Eastern merchants and Nubian emissaries, without translators standing between her words and their reception, was a different kind of instrument than any Ptolemy who had preceded her. She was building a version of Egyptian sovereignty that could stand on its own base, one that did not require Rome's permission to feel legitimate to the people it governed. Her father died in 51 BC, leaving the throne jointly to Cleopatra and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, one with instructions that they rule together. He was approximately 10 years old. The men surrounding him had been maneuvering for years, and in Alexandria, joint rule had historically resolved itself in one direction, toward whoever moved first, and whoever moved first without hesitation. The court was already calculating. The 3 men who controlled Ptolemy XIII were not ideologues. They were not loyalists. They were administrators of access, and they understood with Claurer Chaltrad forum of Carl Prafa from Emperor who Chaurachum have spent their careers navigating palace politics, that a competent queen was not just a rival to the boy king, she was a threat to the entire system they had built around him. Pothinus was the architect, a eunuch with the title of regent. He had positioned himself as the indispensable intermediary between the throne and everyone who wanted something from it. Achillas commanded the army. Theodotus managed the court's rhetorical output, its official communications, its framing of events, the language through which the reign explained itself to the world. Together they constituted something more durable than a faction. They were a parallel government, and Cleopatra's presence on the throne made their arrangement visible in ways that were dangerous to them. She had not made it easy for them to move against her quietly. In the early months of joint rule, she had acted with a directness that left little ambiguity about where she intended the power to sit. Coins minted in this period show her portrait alone, or without her brother's image alongside it. A statement embedded in metal that circulated through every market in Egypt. She had conducted foreign correspondence in her own name. She had presented herself to Egyptian priests not as co-regent of a child, but as the sovereign continuation of a dynasty with divine sanction behind it. Each of these decisions was technically defensible. Together, they formed a pattern that Pothinus and his allies could not ignore without conceding the argument. By 48 BC, she was gone from Alexandria. The exact mechanics of her removal are not fully documented, which is itself telling. Palace coups that succeed rarely generate paperwork from the losing side. What is clear is that Ptolemy, the 13th's regents, moved against her before she could consolidate enough internal support to make the move costly, and that she fled east rather than be captured. She crossed into Syria and began doing what her father had done in a different direction, building a case for her return, assembling the resources to make that case militarily viable, and waiting for the moment when the political landscape would shift in her favor. She did not have to wait long, though the shift came from a direction no one had engineered. Pompey the Great arrived off the Egyptian coast in September of 48 BC, defeated at Phasaelis, his alliance with the Roman Senate in ruins, looking for sanctuary from a king he had once counted as a client. The decision Pothinus made in that moment is one of the more revealing episodes in this entire period. He convened a council. He framed the question correctly: shelter Pompey and risk Caesar's retaliation, or hand him over and purchase goodwill from the man who had just won the Roman civil war. Theodotus, by ancient account, put the calculation plainly: dead men don't bite. Pompey was lured onto a small boat under the pretense of a private welcome. He was stabbed before he reached the shore. His head was preserved for Caesar. When Caesar sailed into Alexandria's harbour days later, he was presented with the head of his former son-in-law and political rival, wrapped in a cloth. The ancient sources record that he wept. Whether the grief was genuine or diplomatic is impossible to determine, but the political consequence was immediate and structural. Caesar had come to Egypt as a creditor pursuing a debt. The Ptolemaic I wasing throne owed an wine sunquorum significant Sambroshisaya Sfrasamik Pom, and as a general in need of resupply. He had not come to adjudicate a succession crisis, but Pothinus had just demonstrated, with spectacular miscalculation, that the boy king's court was capable of executing a Roman general on Egyptian soil without authorization from Rome. That changed the nature of Caesar's presence entirely. He installed himself in the royal palace and summoned both rulers to appear before him. Pothinus had framed this as a Roman arbitration his faction could manage. What he had not accounted for was that Cleopatra, camped somewhere east of the city, with no legal way to enter Alexandria without being arrested, had already understood that Caesar was not an arbitrator. He was an opportunity, and she was moving before the invitation arrived. The method by which Cleopatra entered the palace has been debated since antiquity. Plutarch writing roughly a century after the events, describes her being wrapped in a bedsack and carried through Caesar's quarters by a single companion, a Sicilian named Apollodorus. Later retellings inflated this to a carpet, then to an act of seduction so orchestrated it reads more like theatre than politics. What the embellishment obscures is the operational reality underneath it. She needed to reach Caesar before her brother's faction could characterize her to him first. In a court where Pothinus controlled the official channels of communication, arriving through unofficial ones was not theatrics. It was the only viable approach. She solved a security problem. The romance came later and separately, and should not be confused with the calculation that preceded it. What happened in those first hours between Cleopatra and Caesar is not documented with any precision. What is documented is the outcome. Caesar sided with her. He announced that the joint rule stipulated in Ptolemy XII's will would be honoured, which meant Cleopatra's removal from the throne was rendered illegitimate by the most powerful Roman alive. Pothinus, who had spent years engineering her exile, now found himself in a palace occupied by Caesar's soldiers, watching the political architecture he had constructed get disassembled in real time. His response was to do what he had always done. Why move? Laterally. Apply pressure through proxies, and buy time for the situation to reverse itself. He sent word to Achillas, who was commanding the Egyptian army outside the city. The force that marched on Alexandria numbered somewhere between 20 and 27,000 troops. Caesar had perhaps 4,000. The city became a siege, and what followed, the Alexandrian War, lasted the better part of 6 months and came closer to killing Caesar than almost any engagement in his military career. At one point, he was forced to swim from a burning harbour, and the famous library, or at least its warehouse, annexes near the docks, sustained fire damage during the fighting. The war was not a clean military operation. It was urban, grinding, and structurally chaotic in the way that sieges within cities always are, where the front line runs through them streets and buildings rather than open ground. Pothinus did not survive it. Caesar had him executed early in the siege, apparently on evidence, possibly supplied by Cleopatra, that he was coordinating with Achillas from inside the palace. The charge was plausible enough that Caesar acted on it, which removed the most sophisticated political operator from her brother's side and left the Regency Council functionally headless at the moment it needed coherent strategy most. What happened next exposed something about the dynamics within the Ptolemaic family that even Cleopatra may not have fully anticipated. Her younger sister, Arsinoe, who had been inside the palace during the opening phase of the siege, slipped out and joined the Egyptian forces. She declared herself queen. Achillas, for reasons that may have involved genuine loyalty or simple opportunism, initially supported her claim. Then Arsinoe had Achillas killed and replaced him with a eunuch from her own household named Ganymede. Within weeks, 2 sisters were effectively at war with each other across the walls of Alexandria, and each with a Roman general or an Egyptian army as their instrument, and neither with full control of the situation they were operating in. Ptolemy XIII was released by Caesar at some point during the siege, ostensibly as a gesture of negotiation. He immediately joined the Egyptian forces fighting against Caesar. He drowned in the Nile in 47 BC, likely during the final military engagement, though the exact circumstances were not witnessed and recorded with any reliability. He was 13 years old. When the fighting ended, Arsinoe was taken prisoner. Caesar paraded her through Rome in chains during his triumph. A Ptolemaic queen displayed as a trophy of Eastern conquest, crowds lining the streets to watch her walk. Ancient sources record that the crowd's reaction was unexpected. They did not cheer. They fell quiet, and some wept. A teenage girl in chains, visibly royal, visibly defeated. Rome was accustomed to triumph, but something in that image apparently exceeded what the spectacle was supposed to produce. Cleopatra was back on the throne. Another brother, Ptolemy XIV, sat beside her as nominal co-ruler. A Saitai child, carefully selected, posing no immediate threat, Caesar remained in Egypt for several more months, longer than any military or political necessity required. Their son, Caesarion, was born in 47 BC. The court had been cleared, the war had been won, but Egypt's survival still ran through Rome, and Rome was not yet finished with itself. Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March, 44 BC, and the world Cleopatra had spent 3 years carefully constructing around his continued survival collapsed in a single afternoon. Caesarion was 3 years old. His claim to Roman legitimacy, the central pillar of whatever dynastic future she had been building, depended entirely on Caesar being alive to acknowledge it, and Caesar was dead on the floor of the theatre of Pompey with 23 stab wounds before anyone thought to send word to Alexandria. She had no warning. She had no contingency that could absorb an event of that magnitude. What she had was a kingdom, a child, and a Roman world about to tear itself apart over who filled the vacuum Caesar had left behind. Ptolemy XIV died within the year. He was approximately 15. The ancient sources offer no cause of death and no investigation. Cleopatra had Caesarion declared co-ruler in his place. Teenager, which was not a succession so much as a clarification of intent. If Rome would not recognize Caesarion as Caesar's heir, she would make him Egypt's king and let the political arithmetic work itself out as Rome's civil wars narrowed the field of people she would eventually need to negotiate with. She did not have to wait long to see which direction Rome was settling. By 41 BC, the contest had reduced itself to 2 men, Octavian in the west, Mark Antony in the east, and Antony summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus to account for Egypt's ambiguous position during the wars following Caesar's death. The summons was not subtle. It was the kind of invitation that contained its own answer: attend or be interpreted as hostile. She attended, but she controlled the terms of her arrival in ways that reframed the meeting before it began. She came by river barge, elaborately staged, timed for maximum visibility. Their ancient sources, Plutarch chief among them, describe the spectacle in detail that reads almost like theatrical review. This was not vanity. It was a negotiating position made physical, a demonstration that Egypt's queen arrived on her own terms, at her own pace, and that Antony would be waiting for her rather than the reverse. What followed was a partnership that lasted a decade and has been misread for 20 centuries. The romantic framing, Antony besotted, Cleopatra manipulative, both of them destroyed by passion, was largely a construction of Octavian's propaganda apparatus, which had every reason to reduce a complex political alliance to a morality tale about Eastern corruption and Roman weakness. The documented reality is more structurally legible. Antony needed Egypt's resources to fund his Eastern campaigns. Cleopatra needed Roman military protection to sustain Ptolemaic sovereignty against the growing certainty of Roman annexation. They were useful to each other in ways that had nothing to do with sentiment, and the fact that the partnership also produced 3 children does not change its fundamental political grammar. Antony's defeat at Actium in 31 BC ended the calculation. Octavian moved on Egypt the following year, and Cleopatra attempted what she had always attempted: negotiation, repositioning, finding the angle that converted a losing position into a survivable one. She entered into communications with Octavian directly. The terms she was working toward are not fully known, but the outcome of those communications is: Octavian intended to take her to Rome, not as a partner, not as a client queen, as the centerpiece of a triumph. I am the final proof that the East had been subdued and the civil wars concluded under his singular authority. She had watched what happened to Arsinoe in chains on a Roman street. She understood precisely what was being offered. She died in August of 30 BC. The asp, the elaborate suicide, the final theatrical gesture. These details come from sources writing after the fact, under Octavian's Rome. with obvious interest in how the story ended. What is not disputed is that she chose the manner of her exit. Caesarion was dead within weeks, hunted down and killed on Octavian's orders, because a living son of Caesar, however young, was an unresolvable political problem. Egypt became a Roman province. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which had outlasted every other fragment of Alexander's empire, was gone. She had held the throne for 21 years, through exile, siege, civil war, and the deaths of 2 Roman patrons. She had maneuvered within a narrowing corridor with more sophistication than any ruler her dynasty had produced, and she had still lost, not to a superior strategist, but to the particular exhaustion of a position that required Rome's cooperation to survive, and a Rome that had finally decided cooperation was unnecessary. The history that followed was written by the people who won, and they had excellent reasons to make her something other than what she was.